Great. Well, we'll get started. Well, good morning, everyone. My name's Rob Wally from Controlled Events, and fantastic to see such a great attendance on the webinar today. This session will be recorded and the slides will be available afterwards. And yeah, I don't know about you, but I was a bit webinared out last year. So we held off on putting together a big webinar like this until we thought there would really be a topic of interest. And I'll introduce in a second the colleagues who are going to be panelists on the session today. But housing emergencies for me were sort of part of my early emergency planning career back when I was an emergency planner in local government. And through some of the early emergencies I attended, and actually a couple of colleagues from those are on the call today, back in 2005, 2006, we were learning lessons from 7th of July bombings. We were responding to incidents and working with partner agencies, and actually quite a few of my early projects and incidents involved housing organisations. So I'm really passionate about working with this sector. And in a second, I'll introduce Vicky and Tony to say hello and their experiences. But for me, some of my earliest projects have been about local government, emergency services, housing organisations working together to plan for and respond to emergencies. So it's great today to have such a cross section of housing organisations attending. And yeah, for us, this is a session we want to try and share some ideas and good practice, but there'll be some polls and some opportunities for Q&A as we go through the session as well. So please do use the chat if you've got any questions, queries as we go. We'll keep an eye on that. And at the end, there's a Q&A. You will have the opportunity to talk if you'd like to in that Q&A. We want to make it nice and interactive, but bear in mind the session's recorded as well, just for your information. So yeah, my name's Rob Wally. I run Controlled Events. We established ourselves in 2011. And in fact, actually, my earliest housing clients were the sort of organisations I work with on exercises. So my first ever client was a housing organisation in East London. And actually, quite over the years, that's been sort of several of our clients have been in that space. And what I'll do is just run through the agenda and then ask Vicky and Tony to share the platform just to introduce themselves as well. But what we're going to be covering today is just a bit of an intro from us early on. And then I'm going to be quiet for a bit and actually hear from Tony and Vicky if she wants to jump in with any other examples as well, but highlighting learning from case studies around prevention and response and also what's coming up in terms of legislative changes. I'm going to pick up on a bit around other security and other scenarios that we should be bearing in mind as well. And then we've got plenty of good practice resources to share in terms of what we've been doing collectively with clients and also what's just generally out there that we think you should be aware of. And at the end, there'll be that Q&A as well. And we really want to get your engagement as to questions you've got, problems you're facing, so we can make, really good use of Tony, Vicky, and my experiences of, how we can help you there. So I'll pause for a sec. I've introduced myself a bit. I met Vicky, actually. I was looking back in the sort of resources we had. It was 2018 when Vicky led a major sort of conference workshop, and we supported with an exercise for organisations, and was great to see, especially after Grenfell and sort of a number of high profile incidents, so many organisations working together to try and improve their emergency arrangements. So that was where Vicky and I first met, and I'll stop at this point and ask Vicky to say hello and then Tony. Vicky.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Yeah, it was 2018. Although it seems ages ago, it seems like it was yesterday. It was a fantastic day, that, and I think a lot of people sort of got an idea of exactly what it'd be like, somewhat on the ground, running around and getting involved in things. Certainly by the end of the day, I was knackered, actually. It was a really intense day, so it was fantastic. Yeah. I know a lot of the names that are on the participant list today, so hello to everyone. You may well know me from working in the sector for probably about 17 or so years now. Started off as a health and safety advisor, and have done a lot of work with many clients in the sector throughout the UK over the last 13 years in my role as a consultant, looking at compliance related and building safety subjects. So fire safety obviously key at the moment, and lots going on in the sector, and hopefully lots of improvements coming our way, but still a lot of work for organisations to do. I think for me, this session is sort of understanding the balance really for prevention, as well as what you can do when it gets to the stage where you need to be dealing with an emergency. So hopefully we'll cover some of that today as well. So thanks, Rob. Over to you, Tony.
I'll just unmute myself first of all. Yeah, thanks, Vicky, and hi everybody this morning. I've just remembered that picture has reminded me to update my website because I really don't like that picture. But that's by the by. No, I'm Tony Boulder. I'm ex-Fire and Rescue Service, so I'm hoping to bring some of operational stuff that I've done in a previous life into kind of from fire service operations point of view onto the couple of scenarios we're going to talk about this morning, and then feed that into the stuff I've been doing as a independent consultant in the last few years, working within the Housing Association and working with social landlords across the board, so we can try and map them across, because I sometimes think there's quite a bit of disconnect and a bit of discord between what happens in fire safety legislative wise and then what happens operationally when you end up with an incident. And I know Rob's going to talk about Jessup a little bit later on and how that features in with everything. So I'm going to try and pull that together and use the two scenarios of Beechmere and the Cube to try and give you some ideas of the other things rather than just purely down legislative routes, what we need to be thinking about in these types of arrangements or these types of sessions where we're actually going to deal with the fallouts of incidents and the learning points from them. So that's kind of what I want to try and bring for today, really. So thanks, Rob, for inviting me onto this.
Great. Well, thank you both. And we'll come back to Tony in just a minute, actually, with kicking us off with some learning from incidents and experiences there. And COVID's been a really challenging time for so many organisations. And if I think back a few years ago to my first ever exercise with a housing organisation, we went to a disaster recovery site, simulating them losing their building, and everyone was face to face. And that's how we managed the sort of business continuity challenge, or if it was an on-scene emergency, we'd all be managing it in a very different way to, I guess, how technology and how learning from incidents has changed over certainly the sort of 15 years ago that I first ran an exercise. So from a point of view of learning and COVID, I would say there's been a lot of different resilience challenges emerging from COVID. So home and hybrid working, I think we all accept that we're all going to be working in quite different ways in the future. And actually, it's meaning that we're quite disconnected from our colleagues, and there are new ways of working. And certainly we've worked with a few organisations where what was in the paper plan a year ago and the way they're operating now are quite different things. And home working resilience and security have their challenges. So how are we managing data protection and sensitive data that we're now accessing from our home connections as well? And some of our cyber partners are always telling me about the whys and wherefores of just how challenging that is now, with us effectively working a lot more remotely. Supply chain challenges. So if you saw the Suez Canal the other day with the big ship that's stuck in there in the moment, and just some of the challenges that have come out of Brexit as well, and COVID supply chains, there's quite a few sectors that are under a fair bit of stress at the moment. We're certainly seeing the event sector running out of resources because a lot of resources are employed in different sectors at the moment. So supply chain challenges have been quite a big theme for resilience clients of ours in the last year. And I would say that although a lot of people's focus has been on the COVID response, and I'm sure all of you on this call have had your COVID response and your crisis management sort of running to some extent to manage your operations, but all of the other risks haven't gone away. And actually some of the incidents of note in the last few months have been sort of ongoing fire risks or COVID impact, particularly affecting your organisation, supply chain challenges, or maybe being caught up in protest in cities that have experienced that recently, Bristol just the other day. Network capacity has been a real challenge. So I know quite a few IT colleagues have not struggled, but have faced the challenge, but now they've got to sustain a very different way of managing an incident and having data available to responders in different ways because people are often remote. And as I found on my last webinar, and it's why I shared my slides with Vicky and Tony in advance, internet resilience is key. So if my internet or power goes off, can the activity I was doing still carry on? So those kind of challenges have been just some of the things that we've seen with clients as we go through sort of the last year of COVID, and we're all in a very positive outlook now with the vaccine and everything else, but we can see that some elements of COVID impact are going to be there for quite a few months to come at least. Well, I'm going to hand over to Tony now. I just thought that would set the scene a bit of some of the resilience challenges we've seen. But before I do, and while Tony's talking, there's a poll I'm going to leave up on risk scenarios, just to ask you the question, really, what are the type of scenarios that your organisation's planning for? I've listed a few of the top ones that we see people raising, but feel free to add in the chat any particular ones that you're thinking of. Only the panelists will see anything you pose in the chat, so it will be anonymous. And just feel free to use that poll as we're going through this next session from Tony. But Tony, I'll hand over to you, and you can talk us through, from your sort of extensive experience, some of the learning from some of the big incidents that you picked up on in recent times.
All right, thanks very much, Rob. I think we're just going to start really at Beachmere, and then we're going to move on to the Cube. I mean, we could talk about, blimey, a dozen plus major incidents that have been happening ever since 2017, June 2017, if not before that. But I think June 17, as we probably all aware, is a bit of a line in the sand for where fire safety is going to develop itself in the next forthcoming few years. And I say a few years because that's what it will be. Things like the way we have this institutional arrangement for fire safety in this country, and the way it's all segmented and rather fragmented, unfortunately, and along with governmental wheels and things changing, it often turns very, very slowly. So lots of things that are happening or are planning to happen are not going to happen tomorrow, next week, next month. They're probably going to run into next year and beyond. Certainly with what we're looking at as regards to changes for guidance and things, and some of the secondary legislation, although the government have made some decisions this week that all the secondary legislation, when the fire safety bill comes in, probably in June, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, they're wanting to get a lot of secondary legislation in after the Grenfell phase 1 recommendations by its second anniversary, which would then be around about the end of this year. So we'll see what comes out in that. But yes, we're still going to get fires like this. We are, without a doubt, in the forthcoming few months, few years. It's undoubted that these things will still happen for various reasons. I brought Beachmere into this, and listen, this is only an independent view, looking at it from what I do from a legislative fire safety side and also from ex-operational side, just to give you some idea as a couple of major incidents that have gone on, and possibly learning points looking from these moving forward, and the difference between the pre-planning that went on with this and what went on with the Cube. As you can see, Beachmere, as probably, if anybody's read this, was in 2019, end of 2019 in Cheshire. And it was basically a residential home. It was a sheltered scheme, and it was effectively timber framed. So that in itself is one sort of like important fact to remember. When the government have been pushing for years and years for sustainable living and the modern methods of construction that come in with that, and affordable housing schemes, and when a lot of developers are under pressure to provide complex buildings in a finite amount of time, then a lot of the time that structure is being put together on a timber frame basis, because it's a lot easier and quicker to do that, and there's a lot more flexibility you can do with design than they do with timber, we do with traditional builds. So a lot of buildings are going up at this moment that are still effectively timber framed, and that brings its own problems, because timber as a particular material is combustible by its very nature. And so we build the timber frames, and we build all of the other parts around it. And these type of buildings then tend to lend themselves to have various voids in the way that the building is constructed, and how we actually deal with that right from the design start up to not wanting to get to this point is such an important thing. So can we do next slide, please, Rob? So from the looking out this inside, we need to look at whether or not a fire strategy was actually in the hands of a responsible person. And the fire strategy is basically that information on design point, what the actual buildings are built to and what they are built in accordance with. So we have a real issue, I think, in this country of building things to a standard. So, which you don't think on the face of it, that seems okay, that's what it should be doing. But let's not forget the standards we build them to are minimum requirements. So for me, looking at the and the experience I've had moving into type 4 assessments and doing a lot of the things I've been doing consultative wise with a lot of social landlords, we found an awful lot of the existing stock is a minimum standard building. And really what should be happening at the fire design strategy is take into account what the end use of that building is going to be, and then obviously take that into consideration with the users, the vulnerabilities of any tenants that are going in there, and building that building around their requirements rather than trying to shoehorn them into a building that's been built to a certain standard. And I think that often gets missed. And I often see fire strategy designs which are just one page with a two dimension drawing on it, which then has just lines of compartmentation and the minimum requirements for fire alarm systems and emergency light systems and anything else that's happening as well. So right from the start, we're on the back foot with and then obviously put that as a timber frame structure as well. And not only have we got a effectively combustible building, but now we're putting the minimum feelers in there as well. So all our facilities and things are just up to a minimum requirement. And I think that needs to change. I think when social landlords are looking to do new builds, they should be having somebody on their side as the client, as part of the whole CDM, who actually works with the principal designer themselves and designs that as to what the client needs, rather than the principal designer determining what the client wants. And I think that's a real little change that needs to happen. So we don't know if what kind of fire strategy it was and whether the responsible person, so the person in charge of Beechmere who had control of that particular property, actually had all that evidence in front of them to actually determine what the building was like in the first place. We then look at what type of risk assessment was completed, what type of fire risk assessment was completed, because obviously that's a legal requirement under the fire safety order. Now, for residential types of properties, as you all probably know, there are different variations on types of risk assessments. The minimum requirement, the minimum compliance to comply with the law, is to do what's called a type 1 assessment, which is basically for want of a better word, just walking up and down the corridors, the communal areas, because the communal areas, not the demises, are part of the fire safety order. So people tend to just a compliance only risk assessment, and they'll walk up and down and they'll do basically a look at the overall picture of the building from a communal areas only. We won't look inside the demises, and we won't necessarily do any investigative work with any of the voids, etc. So you then got to ask yourself, whilst it's compliant with the law, is it actually representing the risks of that building? And if we tie that on top of the fact we already know it's a timber frame structure, and if we only have a type 1, are we really providing that holistic view of fire requirements? Because the fire safety order, don't forget, talks about general fire precautions for minimizing fire ignition and spread around the premises. So effectively, if we're only doing a type 1 assessment, then we'd only be making sure we haven't got the minimum, so we haven't got the mitigation for fire spread in the common areas and not within any of the demises. And I think we all are aware that the most likely cause, because actually for Beechmere it wasn't this, but the most likely cause is a fire within a flat caused by the interaction of the individuals that are in there, because that's just human nature and what goes on with what people do. In essence, this was started extraneously outside and moved into the roof void. So there's a roof void where we have another issue as well as regards the length of roof voids and how they're properly compartmented, which takes me right back to the strategy and how the strategy determined compartmentation in these particular buildings. So do we understand what type of risk assessment is done, and is it right for the building? If we haven't got a fire strategy in place and we don't have any information about the history of the building, and let's not forget Beechmere was a stay put policy. So we had residents who, if the fire alarm went off, they stayed where they were until intervention by emergency services or Beechmere View staff to get them out. So they stayed where they were. That was their whole evacuation strategy. So if we haven't got a history of the building and its building structure, and we only have a compliance only risk assessment, how do we know that we can have a stay put strategy? And it's something just to consider moving forward, that all of this fits together. And we have to look at what the building policy was and what the fire risk management plan was for that particular organisation and how they structured that out. On top of that, because it's now a sheltered scheme and we have vulnerable people in there of advanced ages, have we undertaken a person-centered approach, which is straight out of the National Fire Chiefs Council Guide on Specialised Housing, to take that approach where each occupant may have their own set of issues, and how do we approach with them? Because the building, we can only do so much as a building to make the individuals safe, but where individuals have got their own vulnerabilities, we should really be looking at a person-centered approach, which is kind of an annex to the old building risk assessment, to make sure those individuals are safe in their properties, because some of them, if they're advanced age, will have mobility issues. Some of them may not even be able to get out of their flats. So how do we operate in a building and a fire safety culture where we have people who may be bedridden, chair-ridden, etc., and how do we protect them until the intervention actually comes along? So we've got all of that going on to start with, and then obviously with this type of structure, there's a potential for a speed of fire spread, which is then unusual within buildings, where it gets into the voids and moves around the voids, and because things in there are combustible by their very nature, we get a slightly different fire spread, or an accelerated fire spread in some particular areas, which move around the building that you would normally get with traditional builds. So because we have now all of these things, an unusual fire spread, what is our evacuation strategy? Do we have where if we have a stay-put policy, do we then have a alternative to, at some point we change that to simultaneous evacuation? And what is the change for that? If we go right back to Grenfell, let's not forget it was the fire service having to change that and making that, but did they, and they were unfortunately taken to take task because it was said that they did that too late. Well, let's look when we get to the Cube how that had changed since then. So there is lots of learning that came out of Grenfell that brigades took on. But is there a point in a shelter scheme, extra care scheme, where you have a stay-put policy, there is a line where you need to change that to evacuation, full simultaneous evacuation? How does that get done? On the other hand, what was the trained staff to allow that all that to happen? Have we got staff on enough staff on a night time? We're going to have minimal staff. How would they manage this type of arrangement together? What are all the support mechanisms that are coming in for the trained staff? And then what available information is at the scene for the fire service? And we'll have a look at a little picture in a second, which caught my eye looking at Beechmere. So the fire service turn up, and everybody expects the fire service to automatically understand the building. There's something called the 72D part of the Fire Services Act 2004, which means that fire service will come around and do familiarisation visits. But let's not forget, one fire station somewhere with X amount of crews, and even if it's a retained station, which just has the one crew on a call-out duty, they may have dozens and dozens of different types of buildings. So familiarisation visits are good, and they may have something called the Site-Specific Risk Information Document, an SSRI, which they will then complete and be able to put on the mobile data terminals of the appliances. But that's scant information. So they will turn up with so much. And believe me, it's so difficult leaving a fire station and trying to press some buttons on a mobile data terminal while you're driving down the road and have all of this information coming out, and then trying to read it, and then trying to explain that to all the crews by the time you arrive. And you've still got to put all your dynamic risk assessment together. So you can't be in a situation where you get out of the engine and then go, hang on a second, just I'll wait for all this paper to pull out and then I can have a read. It's not quite like that in the real world. So the fire service are really, it's really helpful to have that information ready for them, available at the scene. And have we got that overall emergency planning? And I'll just mention about where the picture we see next. And we take all of those things together that I've just spoken about and all the things you can see on the slide, and then we pull them into an actual emergency planning package. So if you take Beechmere view and you put, if there is a fire here, what is your emergency planning for A, controlling it, B, and then changing your evacuation strategy? All of those things need ideally to be in place. So that allows you as an organization then to counter any particular incident or event that you can foreseeably see what's happening. So if we go on the next slide, please, Rob. This is a picture I took from looking around at Beechmere. And you can see there's the plans. There's the plans for Beechmere. But look at the size of them. And I kind of noticed that this has actually been taken off the wall of the building. So the fire service are trying to work out of plans off the wall of the building. Ideally, we should be looking at A3 plans, and you can see how probably complex some of those plans are, because that wouldn't have been made for fire service actions. So it probably doesn't show things like where the main gas shut-off, electric shut-off is, where our exit points are, who has got particular issues in any particular flat. So we really need to have additional plans made specifically for fire service for them to do operational requirements. And simplistic things as well. I was on a forum, didn't that, where somebody actually said they were cartoon-like. I don't quite get that. But what we don't need is layers and layers and layers of engineering facilities on top of that. Simplistic plans, A3, laminated, so the crews can take it. And everybody wants to move into a digital world, which I get. And we have digital copies. But at the end of the day, when you're fighting a fire at 2, 3 or 4 in the morning, to have actual hard plans that are laminated and you can give to crews to move around as they section it off is invaluable. And all the information that comes with that, and we'll talk a little bit more about PIBs when we get onto the cube fire. So I just wanted to show you that, because obviously that was a key thing, that it seems that that information, it wasn't available to Cheshire Fire crews as they come on board. And actually, I've had discussion with one of the watch crew managers that was on one of the first scene, and he said it was a little bit chaotic. But there again, most fire situations are chaotic to begin with. But it's all about that interaction that you can do as an organisation and planning all of this, because we have these events that are going to happen and happen. We just don't want it to be on your doorstep. And planning to make sure it's properly. So all that information is key. Liaison with the fire service is absolutely key. Getting more and more visits, even exercises at the premises, so that they can understand when they're laying out all their particular equipment, etc. Just again, doing some work in a couple of buildings I'm doing at the moment. We have their dry riser unit, but there's a fence in the way and nobody's ever picked that up. And how on earth are the fire service going to get through a fence to put their hose into? So all of those things, the buildings may look good and they may be right from a legislative point of view, and you may have ticked that box off. But we've got to consider, if we're going to have a fire event, all of those other things that are coming along and getting all of that packaging together. So for the next slide, please, Rob. So what do we need to get? A detailed understanding of the building structure, what buildings you have, how they are built and how they are put together. The design strategy should do that. If you haven't got one, I would suggest you go down a type 4 risk assessment route that will give you all of that platform to work from. And make sure that your risk assessment is effective for that particular building. Yes, I get it, we can still do type 1 compliance, but really are we in that? If we want to protect our whole premises and our vulnerable or other types of residents that are in there, should we not now be doing risk assessments for the whole building, including the demises? It may go into the Housing Act, but still we are covering off the actual detailed requirements of regulation, or Article 4 of the Fire Safety Order, saying that we are there to minimise ignition and minimise fire spread within and around the building. Again, I mentioned that, right at the start, we should be interpreting stuff that we don't do it to the standard. We should be working from the standard and use the standard as a baseline. So we build the building for our residents, for the end use, rather than trying to make the residents fit into the building module. And that's what I said about the client having more interaction with that design. What a lot of people don't get out of the back of everything they do, either from new builds or from material changes or from extensions, etc., is something called Regulation 38 information. So Regulation 38 information is fire safety information that should be given to the responsible person under the building regulations. We cannot have that confused with the health and safety file if we are doing some work under CDM regulations. So the health and safety file will contain an awful lot through the OM manuals, etc., of what fire safety information is being put together. But under CDM, that might go to the client, or should go to the client. Well, the client and the responsible person may be two different entities within the same organization. So we need to make sure that we extract that Regulation 38 information and the responsible person gets that. So now they understand a little bit more about their stock, about their estate, etc. So we've got to understand how Regulation 38 fits in with all of this. I mentioned about the correct detailed FRA, make sure it's the right one for the right purposes. That effective operational liaison with the fire service has to happen. Otherwise, without their input and with it not being a two-way street, we are really going to have problems when it comes to, if you have a fire situation, you can't step back and just expect the fire service to sort it out. They do need some help, information, pre-planning, etc., of everything that you can provide. Have that flexible evacuation strategy. Have that desktop scenario where you say, if I'm on staple, at what point do we need to change this? And then how do we manage it? Let's not forget, the fire service are not there to evacuate people. The fire service are there to create rescues. They're there to rescue people who are trapped. It is your responsibility to evacuate people and at least to have an evacuation strategy in place to allow those individuals, your tenants, to escape freely. It is not the fire service's job to turn up and start evacuating people. That said, the fire service, I am sure, working with you, will hatch that plan together, but you must have that key liaison with them. We talked about the detailed FRS information. Give them everything they can under a site-specific risk information document, but that will only give them the spine of what they have. And like I say, you can't expect them to be trying to read pages and pages of information coming out of their mobile data terminals as they turn up at an incident, because there is too much information for the incident commander to take in, a fire, all that information at the same time, and trying to work out an effective plan. So we need to provide them with additional resources on site, whether that be grab bags or whether the premise information boxes. The government are now talking about trying to make a premise information box almost a mandatory approach for any buildings that are over 11 meters. That's coming out now in the fire safety order consultation document, which has just been reviewed by the Home Office and published the other week. So we've got to look at how we can work with operations, not necessarily legislative fire safety. So fire safety, effectively in the fire service, you can split the fire service in two. You have the legislative side and have the operational side. It's work with operations and legislative side, but operations for what they want at an incident when they turn up. So if we put things like the logbook of our fire alarm system in the PIB, that means nothing to the operational crews turning up. That's just a red book with, I did this test last week. That does not need to be in a premise information box. The premise information box is all about the peeps that, if you have them, any keys that they need to get anywhere, certainly the floor plans, and certainly any other information that you feel pertinent for operational crews to deal with. And then obviously the last bit of this from Beachmere, staff's about to be fully aware of the risks and of the staff involved and understanding the risks of that building and the planning that's going into all of this if we eventually have a fire situation. Okay, Rob, thank you. So we'll just move on from Beachmere to the Cube. This is the Cube was kind of like it just set another line in the sand, because after Grenfell, the main focus was on some high-risk buildings. Originally out of Dame Judith's strategy, she talked about 10 stories or more. The government brought in the 18-meter threshold, and they had it as 18 meters and above. That was an old threshold. It's not arbitrary. It came from when wheeled escapes were around in the fire service in the 60s and 70s. When I joined the fire service, they were long gone, and yet we still have this 18-meter used across the board. So it has some form of historical data in the fact that for above 18 meters, the fire service couldn't regularly enter a building they couldn't get anything above that without entering inside the building. So 18-meter wheeled escapes, and you have, of course, the odd aerial ladder platform or tentable ladder, but they're not necessarily in abundance in brigades nowadays, and they certainly may not be on a predetermined attendance. But of course, nowadays, what happens is that the fire service generally have what they call lake-on ladders, 13.5-meter ladders, or generally 10.5-meter ladders. So we say 11 meters now is the premise where the fire service can regularly access a building. Above that height, they need additional equipment. So I'm glad to see things like the sprinkler system has now been brought down to 11 meters. So anything that you have above 11 meters now automatically has a sprinkler system. So that's been brought it down from 30 meters as it was before. And I'm hoping other things change to a degree. One thing that possibly won't change is this 18-meter rule. The government have changed this to relevant buildings in England anyway, as 18 meters or 6 stories, or above 6 stories. So 18-meter buildings, or any buildings with 7 stories, whichever happens first, basically, effectively. And this was a 7-story building. So at that time, the government were concentrating on higher risk buildings of higher heights, and all of a sudden, an ACM material, and all of a sudden we now have a 7-story building, well alight, with high pressure laminate panels on it. So there's a bit of a rethink on this. But just moving on from the Beechmere, what actually had happened at the Cube was totally different. So we have a fire, which at Glen we've got with cladding. So we have it slightly different to Beechmere, which was a timber frame, but this was a structure which had timber framed at certain points, but certainly it's HPL cladding, and the external fire spread was effectively, as everybody could see there. So next slide, please, Rob. But the difference here, to a degree, was what type of risk assessment completed, and understanding the building structure and the speed of the fire spread is all similar to what we discussed around Beechmere. What type was done? Did the owners occupy as a responsible person? Now, in the event of the Cube, this was a multi-occupied building by different companies. So there were lots and lots of different things going on. And sometimes you get very complex legislative buildings like this, where it was talked about as being Bolton University. Bolton University, it was one of those where they suggested their students would go to get accommodation. It wasn't owned by Bolton University. This was a building which had multiple different occupations in it, different types of occupations, but it was predominantly an accommodation building for different companies. So there were lots of different responsible persons potentially, and where was the owner of the building, landlord, etc., communal areas fitting in with all of this? So that was quite complex. Understanding the building structure again is the same. Understanding HPL cladding, because everybody at the time was looking more at ACM cladding. HPL, as everybody knows, is we need to look at that from an external structure anyway. Speed of fire spread. Now, it was interesting from this point on. This is where GMC got involved. So Greater Manchester Council Fire and Rescue Service had a task force that had looked after Grenfell and looked at Grenfell and realised they had 300 plus high-rise buildings in the Greater Manchester area, and they had other buildings where they needed to look at. But concentrating on the high-rise, Andy Burnham and then the Mayor of Salford put together a task force for the fire service and all of the other interested parties, so all the social landlords around that particular area, all the local authorities around that particular area, and base this a task force for what happens if we have a Grenfell type scenario here. How can we learn from what London Fire Brigade on the night of 14 June actually, if Greater Manchester turned up, or any of the surrounding brigades like Cheshire and West Yorkshire turned up into those particular areas in Lancashire, how would they face that? So on the back of Grenfell, GMC started up its own task force to look at how they would develop this. And they based it again, apart from Grenfell, they looked at Lacanal House, they looked at the Wharfside Fire in Wigan, again, another timber stream building, the De Pass Gardens in London, the Premier Inn in Bristol, which burnt down, and of course, the park in London as well. So that's a lot of experience and a lot of information gathering about those types of buildings. So they had all of this pre-preparation. And what happened was it was quickly developed that when they turned up, they realized that that there was unusual fire spread within this particular building. And it was very quickly moved from stay put to or simultaneous, and they brought in their resources to do that. So the pre-preparation in here undoubtedly saved the lives of people. We had 2 people rescued from the 6th floor externally to the Cube, but apart from that, everybody else was shepherded out. If it wasn't for what the fire service had done in Beechmere and realizing that they needed to get everybody out, if they'd have waited any longer, we possibly could have had another Rose Park, in the fact we could have had multiple deaths. But as it was, 150 people escaped Beechmere, but they lost everything. But that was because the fire service acted properly without any other additional support. Here, we had that action going on with all the additional support that had come from the task group. So it's slightly different, but it's all about that pre-planning. Again, they had looked and seen the potential issues they would have had in various things. And you can take that and say, what stock have we got? how do we need to incorporate the fire service into doing all of this and helping us by pre-planning. And you can take that and then extrapolate it out to lots and lots of buildings. Okay, next slide, please, Rob. One of the quick things that they actually did was put together a very simplistic plan. And when we talked about the plans we did before, they put these on all of the buildings. Brigades tend to do, I think, what, 56, 57 brigades. Brigades tend to do their own different little thing. You know, hypothetically, I could say that the only thing that's the same on a fire engine between anywhere in the country is the hose, because the hose fits in. Everything else can potentially be different because the brigade does its own thing within its own arrangements. But one thing that Greater Manchester did was take all of this and get straight away on the floor, on the external of the building. So when the appliances turn up, this is what they see immediately from a fire service point of view. They understand everything that they've got going on, which they would have had to have waited to try and get out on the back of an SSRI from the MDT. And then they might not have even had this information to them. And let's not forget, a crew might have come for a revisit round this a year previously. So remembering everything is really difficult. So simplistic diagrams like that on the side of buildings to a standard is a massive, massive help. And it's all a part of the pre-planning that goes into looking at events such as fires within your stock. So it's something maybe just to take away from today, and working with the local fire service or any independent fire consultants, etc., and building something similar for your type of properties, because it is so helpful and forms then part of the operational planning that goes into these particular events. Okay, Rob, thank you. So yeah, learning from the Cube. Greater Manchester had also, as well as put the task force together, acknowledged what had gone on from the coroner's Rule 43 letter from Lakanal House. That Rule 43 letter, basically, where 6 people died in a London block in 2009, 3 of them unfortunately were children. That basically said to London Fire Brigade, to the government, we need to do something about external fire spread. You need to do something about access into these buildings, how you operate in these buildings, and the information that's given to tenants around fire safety altogether. Now, unfortunately, you know, London Fire Brigade did something. Unfortunately, what the government decided to do was just bring out the LGA guide, pest-built blocks of flats in 2012 to circumvent this, because the coroner's inquest was in 2013 on Lakanal House, and they basically said, and I remember reading the letter back from Eric Pickles, who was head of DLG at the time, and the procrastination that was all to say, we've just done this, and I think we'll be fine, and we'll kick it into the long grass. And it didn't take long, i.e. 4 years, for that Rule 43 letter to bring itself back into the film. So they got that, they took all the information from that, they put the task force together, they agreed that full evacuation procedure, that change from stay put to full evacuation procedure, was all agreed and all pre-planned. And they trained in such events. And this is about, there's only so much you can do at the smokehouse, at the station. Literally, it's a concrete building. What fire services love more than anything else is being able to get into train in buildings that are on their estate and are different and are complex. So anywhere where we can offer the fire service training against buildings that we perceive may have this requirement for pre-planning and fire strategies as such, training in those areas is absolutely invaluable, because not only do they get that information and that appreciation of the building, they get that in-depth knowledge of how it all works together. And what Manchester did, they did that early major incident declaration right at the start, and then that brought into the whole JESIP, Joint Emergency Services Interactive Protocol, together. And it brought in Gold Command, and everybody was involved, including local authorities, including Bolton University, etc., right early on in this particular incident. So looking beyond what I've just talked about in the last 20, 25 minutes, it's probably Rob going to talk now a little bit more about all that whole the wider thing. But for me, that's just you wanting to plan on your complex buildings, not just your high rises, but your complex buildings where you have vulnerable people, and putting some crisis management and emergency planning together. So if we do have an event like Beachmere, and we do have an event like the Cube, and all those others we've looked at very quickly in what GMC looked at, like Wharfside, Wigan, that we have something in place that makes your organisation safer, and most of all makes your tenants safer as well. So thanks, Rob.
Thank you, Tony. And I think those case studies are really impactful for me. And I've read some of the reports. Last time we were planning an exercise with Vicky and Tony, and actually ran one for a fire service back in January. I looked through the Cube report. I looked through a couple of the other debrief reports, and in the detail of them, it's just all of the rich learning of sort of the missed opportunities, the single points of failure, the area and the plan that with hindsight they could have got right. And it's really good to have those sources of information, because we can't foresee what every scenario is going to look like, but I think some of the learning from each of those scenarios, Tony, is really, really useful there. Tony, is there anything on the sort of what's coming up next? You mentioned a couple of times about what should we be looking forward to what's coming up that we should be aware of. Is there anything you want to sort of add on some of the points here?
I think there's two big bulldozers coming, I think, for want of a better word. One is almost with us, and one is still a little bit farther away, but people are starting to get an idea of where this is going. And I don't want to necessarily be too cynical about these, but there is an inner singing that comes with me on this. So the fire safety bill is coming. That was part of the government's announcement during the election of 2019, that they were going to shake up the fire safety order. And basically, they suggested it was a clarification. And the main two factors in this is the inclusion of external walls as part of the application area. So external walls are now directly involved in the fire safety order in Article 6. And also the inclusion of any fire doors or doors within two domestic properties within an enclosed area. And we can see where that intention's directly coming from, can't we? We can see we're talking about external wall systems on certain buildings, and anywhere now we have two doors within the communal area on any building now, really, I suppose, between domestic properties, obviously. So it's brought in that whole residential, because let's not forget the fire safety order was written primarily for non-residential buildings. It was written for the commercial enterprise, because it fell on the back of the Fire Precautions Act and the workplace regulations. So it was only kind of like that. Residentials are fitted in as an add-on, and that's why we have this situation where you have a property and you've got two main pieces of law in this property: the hallways, the fire safety order, the demises of the Housing Act. And it's never worked properly, and I don't think it still is working properly. So the government have tried to clarify this. But for me, it's an addition. Without a doubt, the fire safety bill was, or the fire safety order, up until, well, still is now, but up until recently, but up until in the future, was all about internal fire spread. It was all about internal life safety of getting people out of a building. And it was never ever covered about external walls. It was never ever covered about, and fire doors, I suppose, were only ever intimated into it within Article 5.4. And that was only saying that somebody had a tenancy. But of course, all our tenants don't read the fire safety order, do they? And they all don't know Regulation 5.4. And nobody really understands about Regulation 14 as well, which is all about keeping emergency routes the same. So they've put this in and they've tried to clarify it in case they've unfortunately been caught with the pants down as regards the law, how it affects buildings and the way buildings work. So there's a massive knock-on for that. So what's been happening, it's been through its parliamentary process, it's been through the House of Commons, and it's been through its first, second stage committee reporting, etc. And it's been through the comments, it's been pushed to the Lords. The Lords made a load of amendments, or tried, shall we say, is the want of a better word, to make a load of amendments to it, because the Lords also brought in the cladding scandal that had been going on with the RICS EWS1 forms. And they were suggesting that leaseholders shouldn't have to pay for any remedial works whatsoever. And that was kicked out by the government because they suggested it wasn't in the spirit of the fire safety bill, and they were going to do things with the building safety bill, which we'll go into in a minute. So it seems to be that the majority, or in fact all of the amendments that were either done are being kicked out, and clearly shows that the government have got a direction of travel with this and where it's going to be and when it's going to be in place. Because I remember watching the report stage. Usually report stages get given 2 or 3 days and given 3 weeks to chew over. This was half a day and just railroaded through. So kind of the bells are ringing about how the government's perceived this, and they've decided obviously now they want to get it to royal assent by middle of April. which means given it's 2 months re in time, it's looked like it possibly becomes live and enacted within the fire safety order around about mid-June if they get their way. The problem you've then got on the back of that is the risk assessment, because the minute you've got external wall systems into the fire safety order, it becomes part of the requirement under Article 9 to complete a risk assessment. But the fire risk assessors, which is still an unregulated sector, I know that Hertfordshire Fire and Rescue Service especially are doing reams of work trying to pull all this together. And you know, from a fire service point of view, they are the leaders in the country on that. But the fire sector is trying to pull, the Fire Sector Federation is trying to pull a central register together. But unfortunately, you know, the fire sector is so separate and so fragmented, you're still going to get all the organisations, professional bodies within that running their own. But the whole idea then is that we're trying to regulate the whole of the fire risk assessors area, but now we've got a problem where the law is going to bring in external cladding or external wall systems, and a lot of risk assessors haven't got the PI insurance to cover themselves to do that. And not only that, the insurance industry itself has become so risk averse. The minute you talk about cladding, everything shuts down. So fire risk assessors, if they haven't got it, trying to get it is so difficult. And they are that if they can get it, they'll get it for a very small amount, maybe 2.5 million or 5 million, but their premium are so excessive. A lot of them are suggesting that it's not worth their while because of the amount of work that they will get out of it. So the problem we've now got is potentially come the summer, we'll have a law which brings in external cladding, but we won't have enough assessors who can do what the law says. And you get a risk assessor turning up saying, yes, I can do the inside of your building, but I'm afraid I can't do the outside because I don't have any PI insurance for it. You as a client, how does that fit with you as a client? Because you need to comply with the law. So it's a very mishmash of what's going on at the moment. There is still, I think, some work going on with the Home Office, with the government, and with the British insurance, and the BSI, I think, the British insurance industry. And we'll see, because I don't know what is going to be the end result of that. Hopefully it'll get fixed, but I'm afraid I don't think there's a magic bullet to it. But that's kind of where the fire safety bill is coming in. And under Section 24, Article 24, the Secretary of State is allowed to make changes to regulations. So what they're also suggesting is that when that comes in, they're going to then put secondary legislation coming in, and therefore secondary legislation doesn't have to go to the floor. It doesn't have to be debated. It can be brought in by the Secretary of State directly. So they're on about now bringing in all of the recommendations from Grenfell, which will then fit under Article 24 and getting put in as secondary legislation. But the Grenfell inquiry is still talking about fire doors and looking at fire doors and making sure that at least every 3 months, critical fire doors, flat entrance doors, and other government brought in cross corridor doors have got to be inspected. So that's still up in the air. There's still a bit of work to do on the fire safety consultation that's coming out, because I think for social landlords to suggest that they're going to do fire doors every 3 months, 6 months, and put them in regulations will be a bit of a fourth bridge, and whether you can do that from a logistical point of view. So I'm hoping that that will get sorted, and that we'll have maybe the social landlords within a framework being able to do things with things like fire door inspections. Sorry,
I think there was a piece that came out last week, obviously wasn't there, on the back of the consultation that came out ironically at the same time as the draft building safety bill last year, and it informed sort of the government work, and they've come out with some measures there that will amend the fire safety order, and a number of measures announced last week, sort of including linking back to what you were talking about in terms of fire risk assessments there. And the competency of that. So the new measures are looking to improve the quality of fire risk assessments and the competence of those who complete them. So there is that sort of link back to the work that's ongoing in the sector. Ensure that vital fire safety information is preserved over the lifespan of all regulated buildings. And I guess that links into the building safety bill and how that looks with the safety case and different things. Improving the cooperation and coordination amongst people responsible for fire safety and making it easier to identify who they are. So I think all of this links very much to what you've talked about, and lessons learned from those two major fires that were there. And I think, again, linking back to requirement for all new flats above 11 metres, tool to install a premises information boxes, and engagement and strengthening guidance and different things. So that's already been announced as being amending the fire safety order to include those measures there, and obviously the cash boost as well for the fire and rescue services. So I think that, in line with the fire safety bill and amending the fire safety order, sort of all comes together, and then of course that will link into the building safety bill as that moves forward as well.
They're also talking about making a standardized approach to the plans that go in the PIBs, and it'll be quite interesting to see what that happens, because I think each brigade, having started this back in Humberside in 2008, I think each brigade do their own thing to a degree. And you see what GMC have already put on regards to their properties, another brigade might do it a different way. So trying to standardize this, I think as long as we have that and the brigade are happy that they have it as the end user, then I don't think we should look at trying to, but anyway, as you say, all of this is coming in. It was quite right that it's been brought in last week. So we are moving in the right direction. It's just whether or not how straight that road is, I'm not so certain, but we'll see. So that's kind of where the fire safety bill is. And then of course, the bigger juggernaut coming over the hill is the building safety bill, and its framework within relevant buildings. So relevant buildings in England are those 18 meters or more than 6 stories. And it's really about the new stringent requirements that are going to be coming for these, both in new builds and existing, and through that golden thread that Dame Judith put together and the gateways that they've put together. So the new building safety regulator has now been announced through the HSE, because it was originally going to be a joint competency authority with the HSE, the local authority building control, and the fire rescue service. And for some reason that was then decided that was going to be a little bit too unwieldy to run. So the HSE are going to run that purely themselves out of a department. On the back of what's written now, there's now going to be a building, there's going to be a product safety regulator, and the building safety regulator and the regulator for social housing are having a memorandum of understanding, moving into how all this is going to work with in-scope buildings. I would like to think that following on from this in-scope buildings, it's going to fall down as well and extend itself to all of the buildings, because we shouldn't just be looking at things on height, we should be looking at their complexities. A general needs block of 12 stories, for instance, it might not be as complex as a 5-story or 4-story extra care facility. We've got to look at the complexities, I think, and what the dangers of each of these particular buildings and the vulnerabilities of the adults. But we've started on a height threshold, and that's where we're going to run. So the whole idea of the building safety bill is to make sure that anybody who does any work with this, and where the competent steering group came out of the back of it, is that anybody who does any work, right from the bricklayers, right from anybody from construction side of it, right through anybody from consultancy side, fire side, anything to do with the building structural side, has the right due diligence and competence to be able to work on these buildings. And that is always going to be a great start, because as we've seen for all of you that have watched the podcasts or anything else from Grenfell Phase 2, you can see that basically the construction industry has been allowed to falsify, to tell not complete truths, to change and withdraw test evidence, to suggest that these products are safe when they're not, or these products are used outside of their scope. So that has to stop. And again, some of the stuff that I see from experience doing what I'm doing at the moment, or part of what I'm doing at the moment, some of the construction of buildings that are only 5 years old, 10 years old, and effectively are cheese graters, for want of a better word, because they've been allowed to be developed and built in the particular way that they're built. So then what happens is that each new building has got to have a building safety certificate, and that's got to go through the gateways at design stage, pre-construction stage, and then pre-occupation stage. If we have existing buildings, it's looking like that's going to fall in under the occupation stage, and then we're going to have safety case reports written for each one, a safety case file built up for new builds, and then we're going to have to introduce this building safety manager role that everybody is probably aware of now, but still nobody can write the perfect job description for it. So there's still a bit of a grey area in exactly what the building safety manager is going to be doing. There's a general idea, but it's not definitive at the moment. The Chartered Institute of Builders have brought out a level 6 on that. I'll be interested to see what's happening with that, because I think it'd be a really good course, but let's see how that develops, because obviously with the Building Safety Bill still going through its parliamentary process, we still haven't got any definitives on the end of the result. One thing that is a bit concerning though is that listening to the there was a joint committee meeting, Clive Betts ran a joint committee meeting about the Building Safety Bill, and there were concerns about the Landlord and Tenant Act within that, and the government's suggestion that leaseholders under Section 9 of that particular act, that leaseholders that had more than 7 years, I think it was, as a leasehold, so generally most leaseholders would be responsible for historical defects, including fire defects, including cladding. So whilst we talk all about the cladding in the government, and Mr. Jemmick brought up the 3.5 billion the other week, that's about cladding. It doesn't mention anything about the compartmentation failures or the build quality. So there's a potential where leaseholders now are expected to be taking out 30, 40, 50,000 pound loans to pay back to the government to pay for historical defects. And that's where the Lords were saying this was morally wrong, and that's why they tried to put their amendment into the 50 bill. Because obviously that's going through the parliamentary process, and it's a lot further down the line than the Building Safety Bill. So it's trying to obviously head it off at the pass, and that was kicked out. I think it was 39 votes. I think it was the difference on the back of that. So there's some things in the Building Safety Bill which still need to be brought together, but all of those, both the Fire Safety Bill and the Building Safety Bill, are trying to feed into obviously the Social White Paper, which is all about tenant safety at its heart. Resident engagement is a massive thing in the Building Safety Bill, and about getting the residents' voice, because obviously with the Grenfell voice that wasn't really heard. Funnily enough, I know somebody in a housing association who had a resident engagement forum yesterday, and out of 168 people, 2 turned up, and one of them was a councillor. So I'm not suggesting that it's easier to say resident engagement is at the heart, and I'm sure you're all listening thinking, yeah, and I know that the reality might be somewhat different, but that is at the heart of it, that the residents are going to have a voice and be known to understand what's happening with the building structure, with the fire safety of the structure, so that they never ever feel unsafe in their properties again. And then, of course, there's the RICS issue, RICS and the cladding and the EWS1 form that's been brought out. RICS are now have just reintroduced revised guidance with the government assistance. That's out on the 5th of April. And to be quite honest, I think it's quite good guidance, because it allows some play on what's required and what isn't required as regarding EWS1 forms. And obviously, there's a valuation point of view, so it's more to do with valuation for tenancies. So possibly where we've got social landlords themselves who own the building and not the tenants individually have to sell their building, whether that falls out of requirement for EWS1, or whether that's a process that we're going to take on anyway for any building that has any cladding above 4 stories without stacked balconies, is a process. So it's all a little bit up in the air at the moment, but those 2 things are coming along. The Fire Safety Bill will certainly make a massive difference, and Vicky's alluded to those additional points. The Building Safety Bill is there to make a definitive difference in the way we do stuff across the construction sector, starting with high-rise buildings. And that's kind of it, really, where we are, Rob. There's lots of other little things going on, but I think people just need to be aware that they are coming. So the social landlords that have buildings that are in scope, that are relevant, should be thinking about this now and not waiting until it suddenly turns up in the middle of next year and they haven't got the information. And again, that feeds in what we're talking this morning about all the pre-planning for doing all of this stuff right now, right today, rather than doing it at Christmas or something.
Well, thank you, Tony. I was taking notes as you went there, sort of real insights of what's coming up when and what we need to, us and our clients need to plan for. Yeah, some really important insights there. And while we were doing the surveys we went through, I just posted them up there. Fire occupying sort of, along with a couple of other scenarios, some of the priority for people. And we've dwelt a lot on fire. What I'm going to pick up on now is 1 or 2 other bits of guidance and legislation that are coming down the track that we should be aware of, and picking up some of the points that Tony made about sort of emergency planning and response as well. So hopefully you're queuing up your questions for Tony, Vicky and I as we go. And yeah, some real insights there on those case studies. So thank you for those. with support from some security colleagues at CAMOR who partner with us, because I'm not a security expert by any means. We're looking at the duty to protect, sort of colloquially known as Martin's Law, arising from the Ariana Grande Manchester Arena inquiry. And colleagues there that we work with have been involved directly in the inquiry, and the Protect Duty consultation came out very recently. It's looking at sort of public venues, large organisations, public spaces, but it will start to have a knock-on impact on anywhere where you've got a publicly accessible place of kind of your might be joining one of these organisations, or you might be needing to look at your arrangements, your emergency plans for security situations. So this Protect Duty consultation is well worth a read. It's something which, from what are the potential implications for you? We've just drawn up a bit of a list. Basically, the ACT counter-terrorism training, which is freely available, it is well worth a look. That's going to be really widened, I think, as a result of some of this consultation, to try and make sure that more people are aware that security personnel have the ACT, the ACT counter-terrorism app, to have resources available to them as well. And that's all freely available, really encouraged and used in other sectors as well. Secondly, including terrorism in risk planning. So most of our plans are generic plans for a range of scenarios, but basically reviewing where does terrorism sit in your risk register, what buildings and locations do you have that might be near a potential target. And this isn't something to do in isolation by any means, but with local resilience forums, with police colleagues, with counter-terrorism security advisors, looking at the risks you face as an organisation, and whether your buildings might be a target or might be swept up in the response to a challenge. Looking at proportionate physical security measures, so not necessarily beefing up security disproportionately, but looking at what physical security measures your organisation has to try and mitigate the risk of a sort of security or terrorism incident there. Next up, staff being trained and exercised. That's sort of thick and strong through some of the Manchester Arena inquiry results, is that we're only as strong as the weakest link. We can have the kind of management awareness and resourcing, and they've been through some exercises, but if our frontline staff aren't fully competent and experienced and confident in arrangements, that's a key area that's been picked up on in the consultation. And lastly, making sure you've got that due diligence of a security plan and a plan for what to do if there's an incident. So if there's a marauding terrorist attack or some other type of scenario, we're not going to be necessarily the organisation responding on our own by any means. The emergency services and others will be responding, but we've got to have our part to play. And I was picking up on what Tony was saying earlier about what can you prepare? So when those responders come to you and they need information, what can you furnish them with that helps them with that response as well? Now, to help us along that road, there's a lot of resources out there. Tony mentioned the Joint Emergency Services Interoperability Programme. That has a range of resources on that website link there, and a free app, which is very worthwhile downloading. The GESIP app, the Citizen Aid app, there's a few apps out there which are free at point of use, which have some good resources for some of your frontline responders. And this was born out of, I think, a frustration in government several years ago that different agencies were doing things in different ways. There was different jargon, there were different responses to incidents. And this is a really common way of operating when we work with different counties and cities now. This is a common language that the emergency services, local authorities and others are using around how they report an incident, how they run their coordination meetings. So all of the kind of jargon and sort of terminology that from an emergency services point of view can become a bit of a barrier to communication has been broken down somewhat by this programme. And you'll see on the left there, you've got some of the commanders from police, fire and ambulance, even being visible at the scene in a sea of high vis. Who are the commanders for each agency? From your side, actually, as a housing organisation, who is the sort of dedicated liaison officer who's going to make themselves known to those other agencies as well? So there's quite a lot of resources on the GESIB website, free training. It's certainly something that those of us on the panel here have seen and benefited from, and it's something which certainly in your plans and your training and exercising is worth dropping in. We're not going to try and replicate what the emergency services do, but we've got to understand their way of working and sort of marry up that with us as well.
Can I just say, Rob, as well? Yeah, that came out of the back of the 7/7 bombings in London, in the fact that it ended up with that major incident going on in central London, where there wasn't really that connectivity between what was happening from fire, ambulance, and police. So on the back of that, the then Home Secretary, Theresa May, then brought out the GESIB principle. I was one of the officers that were bringing this into Humberside area and West Yorkshire area as well. And I think it's a really good thing with the, and I know the major services move on with all their airwave radios on the back of all of this. But I think from an organisation who would support all of this, getting down and taking the methane mnemonic out of it is a really good thing, because I think you'd be kind of on the same page as the people coming along and talking about that, because even at rather small incidents, they may use it in an ethane point of view rather than a major incident declared. They will have a look at all of that. It's kind of part and parcel now of operational tactics using ethane, certainly. So if you have that, or you can click into that, then that's really would be an advantage, certainly from planning point of view as well.
Definitely, and I think it's that it establishes that trust and rapport with other agencies, that we're all using the same language, as you say, and I think it's a big help there. And we were running a housing exercise just a couple of weeks ago, and Tony, you helped with some of the scenario for that, and it was a scenario which in that particular city would have really triggered not just local response, but a lot beyond it, in terms of the whole area. So some of the things that we've been sort of trying to advise people, and some of these points come up in the debrief reports for those exercises we've done, is making sure that you're kind of scene aware. Are you aware of the principles, terminology Tony's just mentioned, and I've shown you there? Will your manager, who's going to be your presence coordinating at the scene, are they aware of these principles, and are they visible as a liaison officer, equipped in a way that the emergency services would be? As you can see there with command units, usually the fire service have brighter and shinier toys than the police nowadays, but you could easily have a fire brigade command unit with a drone unit, if in some fire and rescue services, meetings happening on that command unit, and very easily you could be drawn into those meetings to provide information, as Tony was saying before, and that's kind of being ready for that. Having premises and personnel information at your fingertips is going to be really key there. Beyond that, though, at the scene, there's also at the senior and middle management layer, potentially tactical and strategic coordinating groups, depending on the scale of the incident, where the statutory agencies under the Civil Contingencies Act are going to want to bring you in, formally or informally, maybe in the meetings, or at least feeding into them somehow, your input, because you're part of that responder community. And the tactical meetings would be at what was known as a silver level. Strategic coordinating group would be at a sort of a chief executive potentially level. Those are the kind of things where, if you're aware of them, and there's plenty of resources that we can share with you or are available online on what to expect when you go there, that you don't want to be finding out about what these things mean on the day of the incident. So there's various levels of your organisation that might benefit from a bit of awareness of what you might be meeting. So it's not just about your plan, it's about how your plan sort of connects with everyone else as well. So just a few points that would be sort of helpful there just to consider in terms of your response. And what we've been doing in the last year, really, almost a bit of reflection during COVID, is quite a lot of organisations we've worked with, and certainly my old sort of plan back when I was in an organisation was a big single document that was pretty hard to update. It was a pain to get everyone to feed in updates to. And it was a big old singular plan for my organisational response to an emergency or a business continuity challenge. And nowadays, those things don't really work. Quite a few organisations are throwing them out the window after COVID, saying, well, that's not quite how we do things now. So what we've been doing with a few organisations is trying to break out the what was a single plan into scenario cards for particular buildings or particular risks for the organisation, having much easier checklists that are easy to read. I've blurred them here because they're from an organisation, but effectively breaking the plans down so they need less maintenance because they're easy and portable. So that's something that we've been working on. We've got a couple of free templates on our website that might help there. But certainly making plans more accessible will make them more readable and easier to train and exercise, because this is just one of, usually emergency planning is sort of one of a number of things you're managing. You don't have the luxury of necessarily a lot of time to train people and to maintain it. So those are just a couple of thoughts on the planning side, and I'll just pose a bit of a poll actually for you of your thoughts on the kind of scenarios that we might be facing in terms of your planning. So welcome actually your thoughts on how are your plans structured at the moment? What works for you? Is it a single sort of plan covering emergencies and everything else? Is it a number of documents, or do feel free to specify in the chat, so it will only come to us as panelists, sort of what the kind of nature is of the way your plans are structured, because it's sort of horses for courses. Every organisation's different, but in my mind, making plans portable and easy for different departments to own or different areas to own, may mean more coordination, but means that the plans are a bit easier to maintain as well. And lastly, I just thought I'd mention before we go into sort of sharing some resources in the Q&A is just sort of how do we try and make sure our plans are regularly up to date and maintained. And here there's just a bit of a graphic blurred out from an exercise we did recently, but we've worked with organisations, and Tony, you helped with Vicky sort of with our scenario side of it, and we were talking to organisations that said, we cannot run an exercise during COVID. We cannot have a big set piece exercise with our different managers all responding to a scenario. And we pretty much agreed for most of COVID. And then we realized this social distancing and hybrid working isn't going away. And everyone's become very accepting now. And we've been doing sort of one of these a week at the moment of a remote exercise where you can bring together the right people. It's far cheaper. It's far easier to set up. There's no huge overhead of bringing everyone together, and running remote sessions. And in those sessions, from our perspective, we're using pseudo media. So an online tool where people can see what you would see in terms of requests, phone calls coming in, tweets and requests of you, to bring it to life a bit, because it's all a bit dry sitting in front of a conference call with some PowerPoint slides. So we've put those kind of tools together. And what we try and do, and Tony, you were mimicking this for the exercise we ran, is what are the agencies going to ask of you? And actually just not creating a safe exercise environment for people, but creating those real challenges, because we do want to stress test, does our plan work? Does our way of deploying some resource from our housing organisation to the scene, will it stand up to a significant risk scenario in our area? So that's some of the ways that we've been trying to address the challenge of COVID, where in the past, and Vicky, that workshop, 2.5 years ago or so now in Birmingham, we had the luxury of everyone face-to-face. You can dust off your plan. We're all face-to-face. It's not easy doing these things remotely, but actually with breakout rooms, facilitators, and if you're doing it yourself, just actually having some slides and some materials and enough people to break people into different groups, maybe by their command level, run your meetings and build that sort of familiarity, can be really, really helpful. And it is possible to do online. It's challenging, but it's something that can be done, I think. And we're certainly seeing a lot more organisations more receptive to remote exercises as a way of doing it more frequently, but little and often. You don't want to do this once in a blue moon and then everyone's forgotten it before the next time you need it. So I just thought it was worth dropping in as a bit of an idea. And we've got some resources that will be hyperlinks on the slides we share with you to GESIP. There's some sort of broad guidance from London local authorities on housing, a bit on exercising, a link to our resource portal where some of the content from today and other free resources are available. In my mind, and the whole ethos, I think, behind sort of Vicky and Tony's support as well, is that like we work and support organisations, but we're sort of really keen on just helping people make their teams, their residents, everyone they work with safer. and some of that is just actually some resources which could help you yourself. So I mentioned what 3 words there, quite a few emergency services in different agency areas, and local authorities are using that now as a good way of marking a location where the rendezvous point is, for example. So there's lots of just different free tools that are out there now that are becoming part of the emergency response, and quite a lot of learning online as well. Going back to what Tony was sharing, each of those incidents he shared, there's clips online, there's reports, if you want to go into the depth of those things as well. So I thought I'd pause on that point and now really open it out to our Q&A. So, and it was good to see in the poll there, some of the feedback was more a bit of a balance really. Some of you have got a single plan covering emergencies and everything else. Others have got several. So I think there is always a bit of a different ways of approaching it, but it was good to see just how some of your plans are structured. Now,
I think one of the other things, can I just add as well, Rob, to your free resources there? We're just going through a sort of overhaul of our website at the moment, but we're developing a lot of sector-specific training at Housing H&S Compliance. One of those is the fire safety basics for housing providers, which will sort of put a bit of background, if you like, to what Tony's talking about today. So the legislative overview, the fire risk assessment stuff, but also looking at, you know, some of the more specific requirements around fire safety equipment, for example, and the British standards and things. So, you know, we've got one of those coming up next month. We've got a series of those that have been IFSM accredited as well. So for those that want to find out maybe a bit more specifically about fire, you know, we've got one of those coming up next month virtually, and that's available on our website to see as well. So if people are interested, they can visit there too.
That's really helpful, Vicky, and I think it's that blend of like we can come out and help organisations, but I think there's just those resources that can help you to help yourself, that which we're really keen on sharing as well. So hopefully you gained some insights. I've certainly been taking notes while the other speakers were sharing some insights as we went there. And as I say, we'll share the recording and the slides afterwards. But now's your chance, while we've got a few minutes, just to pick the brains of Vicky, Tony, or myself on any questions you've got, any thoughts. Feel free to raise them in the Q&A or the chat feature there. We can actually allow you to speak if you want to contribute something directly. Interaction's always good on these calls. So if anyone like to jump in with a comment, an observation, a query, any jargon busting, now's your chance to speak. And if we were face to face, I'd be trying to bribe you with Haribo for the first person to speak. But in these COVID times, I can't quite do that. So if anyone wants to jump in with your first question for the panel, feel free. It'll be tumbleweed for a minute and then a flurry, I hope. Well, I'll jump in with one while you're thinking. Tony, you mentioned about premises information boxes, and I've seen those before. And you were saying that they're going to potentially become something that's mandatory for buildings of a certain size. I've heard people before say, look, the expense of these things, will it be almost like a common standard? Because I know there's like a couple of providers out there. Is that going to become a sort of a huge burden for organisations to have to sort of invest in these for every building? I mean, I guess that they're secure for a good reason, which is why they're expensive, because you don't want the sensitive information being released. But what's your take on that sort of new requirement and burden for people?
It's always been a risk base, and I don't think many people have known about them. I came across them way back in 2009. I think I was the first brigade in the country for social housing to put them in all the high-rise blocks in Hull. And therefore, we kind of led on what we wanted to put as the end user in those, and we developed our own thing. And the brigade get a helical key, which you get a suited key. If any of the social housing providers today have got them, they get a suited key, and the brigade have got like a master key. I'm still surprised today, even though the government are suggesting that this might be a standard approach for buildings of a certain height, that a lot of the brigades, or not a lot of the brigades, some of the brigades still don't have the master keys. You know, we're working with one brigade with another client at the moment where we're looking at high-rise blocks and complex blocks and saying to them, you know, we could do with the premise information boxes, an external one, because you get different types I'll talk about in a second. And they go, well, we don't have the master keys. And I'm kind of like, how is that not right? You're pushing for all this information, yet you still haven't got a key to get into the box. So that was almost like the Russian doll syndrome. We'd have to ban with a box for the key to get into the box with the keys, kind of thing. So there's different variations that these premise information boxes for sheltered schemes and things. A lot of them have internally. And obviously, if we've got staff 24/7, the brigade can get into that particular point and either have a grab bag or the internal box, which they can get access to. That'll give them all the relative information they need. In other circumstances, maybe general needs blocks and things, then there's external bonds, and this is the kind of ones that I worked with all those years ago. And these are high security boards, and they are expensive, but in the relative of a refurbishment build or whatever we're doing under fire safety budgets, they're next to nothing. And they basically sit outside. The high security, that anti sort of like tamper-proof, all sorts of things, and they will withhold whatever information you have. So they're pretty critical. And finally, now after all of this time, at least somebody somewhere is understanding their importance. I think there's a working group going on for what standardization should go in the premise information boxes. But again, for me, I think it's going to be down to the end user. The end user at the end of the day will dictate what they want in, rather than it being dictated to them. So they are important. I haven't used them and haven't seen their how good they are, their advantage that you have at incidents. I try and promote them where I possibly can, where I think we need. And let's also not forget as well that the standard that's come out for the evacuation emergency, evacuation alert system for high-rise blocks now, it's not part and parcel of codes of practice, but it's certainly pushed now as a recommendation for being able to evacuate people. Because obviously one thing that came out of Grenfell was that once they changed from that stay put to actual evacuation, and I had an 11-story block a lot of years ago in Hull where it was completely smoke logged through just a chair in the bottom, and a upholstered chair had been set on fire. The fire was out after 3 or 4 minutes, but of course the smoke had permeated throughout the building. And I had all of these residents hanging out of their windows saying what's happening. So that information, to get that from stay where you are to evacuation, is important. And that was learned on the back of Grenfell. But they're going to come in premise information boxes too. So there's also we don't want one, but kind of we need to put it for this building, but we still have to have one for this building. So I think for me, it should be used on a risk basis, not just height threshold, but the complexity and risks that they have, and whether we need them internally or externally, and just work with the end user, work with the brigade. They will always, they will never say, no, we don't need one. They will always suggest that. It's always an advantage to them, but make sure they've got access to get into them, and then just work out with them what they need. But I think they're always a massive advantage,
Right, thank you, Tony. Well, we're just about up at time, and I noticed a couple of comments from individuals on how you're overhauling your plans, what your takeaways are from the session, which is great to have that engagement. So we'll be sharing after this session the slides, access to resources, some of what Vicky's been mentioning in terms of what she's got coming up as well, which is great. So just keep the dialogue going with us. We're really here to sort of share information and resources to help you. A lot of colleagues we know and new colleagues joining us today, which has been fantastic. It's been great to have, just on behalf of all the attendees, I think, Tony and Vicky's input today. Hopefully I've shared a couple of useful tidbits as well. I do the Chris Whitty routine for Tony of next slide pretty well now. I'm getting used to it. But great to have everyone here today. Any final remarks from Tony, Vicky, before we close, and then we'll look forward to engaging you all again soon.
Just thank you for pulling it together, Rob, and asking us to be involved in this. Very much enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yeah, I echo that. Thanks, Rob. Thanks very much. And hopefully somebody's got something out of it today. So it was just benefit for doing that. So thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, everyone. We'll have a great rest of your day. And by tomorrow, you'll have an email with resources and information. And thanks again for attending today.